Hi, I'm Jason, and this is basically going to be a fun talk about Blender and all the fun stuff associated with that. And really, hopefully my screen should be sharing now. But really, this is really meant as kind of a high level sort of thing. The amount of time we have, I'm not going to be able to teach you how to use Blender in that. I'm going to try to do that at Open Source 101 just a little bit, but this is really about Blender's a conversation piece that a lot of people have been talking about, and it's something that's near and dear to my heart. So this is really about what is Blender, what does it do, and these sort of things. And the main thing I like to think about Blender is that it's a Swiss Army chainsaw of computer graphics. If you do anything with computer graphics, Blender probably has functionality to do that thing you want to do. And it may not necessarily be the best tool for that job, or the most specialized tool for that particular task, but if you need it and you know how to use it, it's great and it's available and it's open source. So that's always another fine benefit of that. Of course, quick introduction of me. This is me. I'm Jason Van Gumster. I've been in the Blender community for a really long time. I've been using it since before it was open source, which is 97, 98. And in that time, I've written Blender for Dummies. It's in its fourth edition currently. I'm a lead moderator at blenderartist.org, which is where one of the largest user communities for Blender users on the web, and have a small podcast that I haven't put an episode in for quite a while called The Open Source Creative, where I talk about doing open source production and creative things using open source tools, and all the topics associated with that. And prior to all of this, I ran a small animation studio for about 8 years called Hand Turkey Studios. And so my current thing that I'm doing is I've teamed up with the good people over at CG Cookie, which is an educational platform for Blender. And I'm working with them to help Blender get better integration with tool makers and studios and anybody who wants to use Blender in their particular pipeline, which does include the entertainment industry, but it's not limited to that, because Blender, again, does so many things. That's one of the things that I'm really hoping to uh, sort of hammer in as we continue talking today. So speaking of which, let's actually talk about Blender. What actually does it can it do? What does it do? And I think I can go on and on about it, but really the simple version of it is a full-featured 3D modeling animation suite. That's sort of the tagline for what it is. But I mean, really, what does that mean? And better to show than to tell, I think. So I'm going to try and show. There's a show reel or a demo reel that the folks at the Blender developers have put on the Blender website. I'm just going to share that. It's about a minute and a half, and it is going to be streaming through YouTube through Zoom. So it may be a little bit choppy. Hopefully, it's not. But uh, if it does end up being that way, I encourage you to go to blender.org and look at it there. But let's see how well this works, if at all. So let's see, make that. It's worth mentioning this is the work that the artist that created a lot of these pieces that were in the show reel, and really should hopefully give at least a semblance of understanding of what Blender is used for. Um, it has the 3D modeling, sculpting, rendering, all sorts of really, really exciting things. And really, so I mean, we were talking about animated movies, television shows, video games, visual effects, and all the sort of things that are maybe not as expected. So, like currency design, which I've spent some time doing, automotive design, fashion, high performance computing. There is a whole slew of things that Blender gets used for because, again, it does so many things. It's not just about creating assets and creating things in 3D. You can also draw in 2D. You can also, of course, render those things out to films and movies. All of that stuff that was showing on the screen that was produced in Blender, including the motion graphics of the animated text in there, that was also cut and edited and generated in Blender. So all of these things are able to be done. In fact, early, I remember, again, I've been in the Blender community for a long time. Tom Rosendahl, the original developer of Blender, he used to give his talks and presentations using Blender as his slide projection thing. I think we've evolved a little bit beyond that, but it's the fact that it was even possible to be done is pretty incredible. Now, let's see if I can. There we go. So one thing I do want to talk about is Blender's story, because in the realm of open source and in the realm of software in general, it's a pretty unique thing because Blender originally started as an in-house tool for a small Dutch production company called Neo Geo. This is no relation to the SNK video game system from way back in the day, though that was very cool. There's no relation, just the same kind of name. And so they were a small production company doing television commercials and those sorts of things. And they basically wrote their own in-house animation and modeling suite to do the work they needed to do. And as they did that, they started working with it and sharing some of that with folks on a limited basis. And there was a lot of interest in it. And so what they ended up doing is spinning that off into its own company called Not a Number. And that continued the development of Blender as a proprietary tool to get people more interested in it. It had it was kind of the old shareware model a little bit, because you had the basic free version, but you could actually purchase what they called a C license key to access some additional professional features and those sort of things. It's not an unfamiliar story in the open source world, but this was again or mid 90s, so it's still fairly new in terms of that regard. And they had a lot of fanfare, and a lot of people were starting to use it. And the price point, in addition to even for the license version, was still very reasonable. We're talking like maybe $100 compared to, at the time, comparable software was in the thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. And so they were really, really getting a lot of interest in moving forward with it. Now, downside is that this was all happening right around that time of the dot-com, I'll say, implosion. And so, like a lot of other companies, Not a Number went bankrupt. By the time that that happened, however, Blender probably had roughly 250,000 users. 250, yeah, that's the right number. Roughly around 250,000 users who were very, very interested in keeping Blender and using Blender. So the original developer, again, his name is Tom Rosendahl, is a very, very awesome guy. He went to the holding company and tried to, and basically struck a deal with them and said, look, if we can raise money to purchase the IP from you and open source it, is that something that we could do? The number they struck on was about 100,000, was not about, was 100,000 euro. And so there was a free Blender fund. There was a big campaign to sort of liberate Blender from the holding company and explicitly release it under the GPL. And the expectation was that it would take, I'd say, 6 months to a year to raise 100,000 euro from the community and free it up. The community did that in 7 weeks. And from that point forward, we've all sort of felt this notion of ownership of it. It's a it's one of the first examples in that I know of, at least in the world of open source, where the community got together and actually bought a piece of proprietary software with the explicit intent of making it open source. And from that point, development skyrocketed. And I mean, not just in terms of user interface, but in terms of in terms of functionality. Before before Blender was open source, there was no undo. There's no Control Z functionality at all. You sort of had a bunch of different ways to kind of get back to where you started, or um, you just have the realm of, well, if you do it again the second time, it'll be faster. Uh, but one of the first features that got added, and this was 2001, I think, one of the first features that got added was undo, and then from there, tons and tons of things happened. Out. We started working with the Blender Foundation was what grew out of that fund. And one of the things that, as they were working, that they realized is that so many, especially when it comes to creative tools, when it comes to creative software used for creating things, um, they sometimes get caught in a vacuum, right? The people who are developing them are maybe sometimes a little siloed away from the people who are using it. So you have these user and developer silos, and it gets very difficult to um, get a real firm understanding of what's needed versus what's the cool thing to sort of add in there, because I think it's kind of interesting. And what Ton and the Blender Foundation decided to do was start these things called open projects. Because again, Blender started as an in-house tool. You had a developer or developers sitting right next to artists, and when the artist says, "Well, I wish we could do this thing," the developer's like, "Oh, okay." Clackety clackety clack. It doesn't actually work that fast, but but then that feature would be added because that was a necessary thing for production, and there's a real benefit to that. So what they started doing is they launched the Blender Institute, where Blender artists would actually come to Amsterdam, sort of the birthplace of Blender, and work together in a studio environment with developers on site, so that, and the purpose there was to, yes, produce a short film, or in one case they did a small video game. The idea was to produce that, and in the course of it, Blender would get battle tested for production. It would get features that were actually useful and critical and necessary for getting productions done. And you'd also get feedback in terms of user interface, in terms of, yeah, Blender can do this, but I have to sort of do lots of weird stretching and calisthenics with either my hands or just mental stretches to get it to do what I need it to do. And a lot of those features, a lot of those things came into being from doing these open movies now, or these open projects. Now, what's even cooler about that is that when the films or game or whatever was produced, when it was completed, not only was it done using all open source tools, but they decided to release all of the content for that, not just the actual finished product itself, but all of the content that went into make it, the 3D models, the rigs, the scripts, all of the different things that went into textures, all of the different things that went into actually producing that were all released under a Creative Commons license. So it was one of those first times that people who had never seen what goes into the production of a short film or an animation or anything, any of these things, you don't have an understanding of what the full pipeline looks like, right? Most of the time when you work on something especially when it comes to 3D, it's an inherently collaborative sort of medium where you have to work with other people because you're specialized on a particular task, because the thing that you're producing is just large enough. It's difficult to do it all by yourself the whole time. And so this was one of those really great educational tools, because you got to see how people structured their files, how they handled actual features like being able to link assets from one file to another, what sort of headaches would go, because they would also blog the headaches they would have as they produced it. And so you'd get a real sense of um, where problems were in the production. And when I was doing my own productions, it was very informative, because I could say, oh, they made a mistake there, I don't have to do that, I can do it a different way. But also, oh, I need a mechanical bird, they did that in that film, I'm going to borrow that because it's under Creative Commons license, and you can produce those sort of things, which is really excellent. And really, I think it's one of the key things that not only produced good sort of show and tell content for Blender, but it also really got a sense of real world production aesthetic and sense for it. And that's a really um, big component of that. And so the natural extension to that a little bit later was the Blender Cloud. At this point, everything is sort of growing out and being that cloud-based sort of paradigm. And what the Blender Foundation and Blender Institute ended up doing is they developed the Blender Cloud. So all of these assets have to be stored somewhere and have to be accessed somewhere. And not just that, but also educational content in terms of how it's set up and how it's used. And the Blender Cloud is where a lot of that stuff lives now. So you have a lot, they produce both free content as well as stuff that is, a subscription based thing to actually help not only produce these short films and projects, but also foster that development for those particular things. So there is a Blender development fund where which has been growing by leaps and bounds for just general Blender development, but the Blender Cloud finances the actual productions, the open projects at the Blender Institute and Blender Studio now. They've had a few different names now. Uh, that finances that actual production and helps really keep the Blender developers with a sense of what artists need and artists want in in a real sense. And so that's one of those things that's been very, very beneficial. Again, you get to see the structure, and they've done a really good job of opening communication between what's happening at the studio and what's happening with developers and what's happening with everybody else who's actually using the software. Because again, not all of us use it just for the entertainment industry stuff. We're not just using it for visual effects or animated films or video games, but there's a lot of uh, I'll say exciting uses that people wouldn't expect, where you're using Blender for 3D printing prosthetic limbs for animals that have been rescued, or you're using it for studying large data sets from astrophysics, which because other conventional 3D software just can't handle that amount of data going into it. You're using it to teach programming to kids because Blender's got an integrated Python API, and Python's fairly easy to pick up in a general sense. And so those sort of things have been really beneficial. And then on top of that, well, one of the other big things that have been uh, really helpful for Blender in particular, especially when it's adopting into sort of these larger productions, when you start talking about getting Blender into, say, larger film studios or larger visual effects studios or game studios, or even I'll say conventional business environments. Those environments tend to be a little slower moving in terms of how quickly they update things. The notion of a stable environment upon which to do your creative work is pretty important. And so they don't necessarily upgrade to the latest and greatest software as it comes out. Blender's development cycle is very rapid. We're talking probably for at least 4 releases a year, if not more. And so in order to help facilitate that, Blender actually started doing LTS releases. And those are very much like, we'll say, Ubuntu's LTS. In fact, they're so much alike that Canonical is now providing desktop level support for LTS versions of Blender. And that's one of the sort of new twists. I think that happened last year. And it was a big announcement. And so that's one of those things where, yeah, you have that talk between developers and individual artists or small studio artists, but now you're able to facilitate working with these larger environments and larger, more I'll say slower moving in terms of upgrades and infrastructure. And so that's been a really big part of that, and sort of a little bit of where I fit in, because while Canonical can handle the sort of the desktop support, how do I do this, why is it not working, those sort of things. What I've been doing with Which Orange Turbine is a lot of, I need this to work in my particular pipeline, right? You'll have a studio that says, I need Blender to do this particular thing, and trying to get a file out of Blender or a 3D model out of Blender and into another software package is sometimes fraught with difficulty for a variety of reasons, not the least of which are closed formats that don't like to talk to one another. But those are the sort of problems and solutions uh, that I've been working with and trying to help a lot with, especially. And one of the surprises that I've discovered is that studios tend to have pipeline TDs, technical directors, and people who at least do some form of simple scripting to keep things working or automate certain processes and those sort of things. But the people who produce tools for these studios that need to integrate with Blender as well, they're focused a lot on developing their tool, not so much the integration with other tools. And we've been doing a lot of work helping tool makers understand Blender so that they can make it they can play nice together, which has been a really, it's one of those things where you expect, you should have expected that to be a thing. But the fact that we've learned that over the last year or so has been pretty exciting and pretty interesting. And
Hey,
so this is,
Jason.
oh, go on.
Oh,
Yes,
so sorry to interrupt, but we do have about 5 questions that have come in.
sure. Hit
Would
me.
you like to, maybe can I feed you those questions now, or should I wait? Or I was trying to wait for a right time or a good time to break in, but I feel terrible for interrupting. So
No, no, no. Go ahead. Go ahead.
thoughts?
I know
You
that I have
sure?
a tendency to speak fast, so
Yep.
breaks for breath are hard.
Well, so do I, so I can relate. But no, you're doing a fantastic job. So Carl Conrad asked, I hope this isn't too specific, but can you talk a little bit, maybe a teensy bit, about grease pencil and 2D? Also, he finds it harder to find info on grease pencil, like tutorials. Any tips on maybe finding a tutorial or some educational content on grease pencil?
I love grease pencil. So grease pencil, I'll give a little background on this. One of the cool things that came into Blender a handful of years ago was the ability to do live annotations on your 3D work, and those annotations would be in 3D space. So you could actually draw in, I'll say 2D drawings in 3D space just to give notes. And this was really beneficial. Originally, the tool was there for animation directors. So you have a character who is doing an animation and you want to just do a draw over and say, I want the pose to be exaggerated like so, put their back up to here, put their head over here, really, really stretch and push the design like that. And that was the original. And so not only were you drawing in 3D space, but in order to give those notes within an animation, you necessarily had to be able to animate those notes. And what people started doing is making 2D animations with that annotation tool. And with Blender 2.8, that annotation tool got, I'll say, promoted to being a first class citizen. And so you can actually add grease pencil objects now as proper 3D objects in Blender and do all sorts of weird and crazy and fantastic things with it, that you get the benefit of doing hand drawn 2D animation, but you could also rig it like a 3D character. You can apply modifiers to it to give it some procedural benefits, and there's so many cool things, and a lot of that development is being driven by a single developer. His name is Antonio. I forget his last name. I really should do a better job of remembering that. But he's been working very close with Daniel Martinez Lara in Spain, who is a very excellent hand-drawn animator. Actually, he's a 3D animator as well, but he's a very excellent animator who runs a small animation school there called Pepe Land. And their collaboration has been doing a whole lot for um, building up what can be done with grease pencil and really fleshing out the feature set and doing that. Now, the and yeah, the difficulty is um, finding. There's a lot of content online for Blender with respect to um, the 3D things that it can do, and it tends to, the amount of things that you can do with sculpting and modeling and those sort of things tend to overwhelm the amount of educational content you can find for Blender, because that's what a lot of people are doing. It's one of the easiest entry points. Once you get into animation and then getting more into 2D animation, finding some of that gets to be a little bit more difficult. And there is a woman. She's Canadian. She's very, very cool. She's been using Blender and Grease Pencil not so much for animation, but for just doing 2D art. And she does her work looks really, really great, and it's kind of got a watercolory kind of a aesthetic to it, and it's fantastic. I would encourage you. She's been doing a few videos, walkthroughs about how things work. I'll try to look up the name and get that posted either on here or via email. The easiest thing to do is, I say it's easiest, but there is a video that was posted on blender.org, I would say um, October of last year. The video is entitled "Blender Is," and everyone was giving sort of an explanation of what Blender is to them. And she was one of the people that had a little vignette on there, and you could see her work and get her name. And that's probably faster than me trying to remember it off the top of my head or look it up for you, but I will still do that. And that she's a great resource for it, I will say.
Okay, very cool. Matthew Glassman said, what is the entry point to Blender if you don't have much of a design or artistic eye? And then he kind of clarifies that and says, I guess, what is the learning curve for basic usage?
It's better than it used to be. Blender has always had a reputation for, um, I'll say, a rather unconventional user interface. A lot of the things, especially if you already understand other 3D software, it used to be that I used to tell people you kind of have to unlearn a lot of things to wrap your head around how Blender works. That has changed quite a bit, especially with the most recent set of releases of Blender. There's been a lot more tools and things that have and interface adjustments to make it more comfortable to people who are used to, I'll say, more conventional ways of working. When I talk about that, I talk about um, Blender. The biggest one to think of was, in for the longest time, the default in Blender for selecting anything was to right click as opposed to left clicking. And there's a lot of great reasons for that, which I will not start arguing about because that's a whole little rabbit hole for me. But that with 2.8, that was switched over to being left click by default, and a number of other things have helped with that. I will say that video tutorials are one of the biggest ways that you can to the point where you can go on YouTube now and be pretty overwhelmed with just the sheer number of Blender tutorials that are out there. I'm convinced that it dwarfs all of the other different 3D software out there combined in terms of educational content online. Uh, Now, a little shameless plugging, of course. I did write a book, Blender for Dummies. That I like to think that's a fairly decent entry point into using it. It is meant more as a reference, but it does allow you to work through a little bit. Once you wrap your one of the cool things about Blender is once you start wrapping your head around how it handles data and how it works. Those concepts can be applied to the other sort of components of Blender. So if you know how to model, at least basically within Blender, then a lot of those concepts can be extended to animation, can be extended to working in Grease Pencil, can be extended to uh, working in the compositor, for instance. The uh, geometry nodes that have recently been put in there are also a whole nother ball of wax. It's incredibly cool. But yeah, I would say that going on for YouTube tutorials, CG Cookie also offers some free content that helps get started and really familiar with it, as does the Blender Cloud. They both have good introductory sets. Also, I feel remiss I would be remiss in saying that Blender Guru, the name is Andrew Price. He has I think the most popular intro tutorial is the Blender Donut tutorial, which is a fairly decent walkthrough about getting you started with actually creating things. And you can probably fill an hour of content of just seeing people's donuts that they've created from that, and literally having one show every few seconds. So
Is
hopefully
the
that helps.
is the person's name Sophie Jantak? Is it
I
Sophie J? Andrea
think so.
Kwan, she put that in Q&A. Is it Sophie Jantak? And then she posted a YouTube link. So I'm not sure. I just wanted to sort of inject that. And so I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I guess I just wanted to let you know, and then everyone else knows that Andrea thinks it might be Sophie Jantak. So I at least wanted to pass that along. Let's do
Yeah,
one more question maybe, and then
sure,
we'll let you get back to your presentation. Do you know
sure,
if
sure.
Blender is approved to work on US government projects? I know the DoD gets squeamish around software from other countries, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Um, That I don't know anything offhand. Like in terms of like a certification or some kind of approval form or letter. I'm not familiar with any of that.
okay.
I do know that I have used Blender in context of some high security stuff, and um, there hasn't been a whole lot of issue with that. Really, the concerns there was actually educating them on how the GPL works, and know whatever I create in Blender is not something that has to be released under a Creative Commons license with the GPL. That was really the conversation I've had to have more often than not. But in terms of actual like official like being sanctioned for use in government thing, I'm not familiar with anything
Okay.
that says yes or no to that.
All right, fair enough. Okay, with that said, we'll let you get back to the presentation and then we'll come back for some more questions.
Sure, sure. So the last little part of that is really talking about where Blender's development's going from here. And this is actually a timeline that was taken from actually a couple of years ago. And we are we're after just after the release of 3.1, we're getting or 3.0. 3.1 is going to be done a little bit later this year. So they're lagging a touch, but the LTSs have a 2-year lifespan, and they've been doing a great job of keeping those up to date and maintaining those and keeping bug fixes. And I think a lot of studio environments have really appreciated having uh, that level of stability in the release. And of course, that same model's being taken out through at least 2024, and that's also no one else. You've seen LTS releases uh, for full operating systems, but there aren't very many other applications like userland applications that make use of this concept. And so I think they didn't want to plan more than a handful of years ahead to make sure that this is something that has traction and is working. And thus far, as far as I can tell, with the studios and enterprises that I've talked to, it's been pretty handy to have that kind of benefit there. Great. So now that you know about Blender and you like it, how would you get started actually using it? And this does go a bit into some of the questions that were asked. I mean, really, there's two tracks here, right? Two primary tracks to think about. One is specifically for artists, and so again, there's so much online content, particularly on YouTube, PeerTube, and a whole bunch of other places where you can actually. One of the benefits of having video instruction for a creative application like Blender is that you get to see people's mouse travel. You get to see where they're moving things around, and you get a little bit better sense for their workflow. There is something to be said about having text to reference or being able to not have to pause, and you can parse through it when you have written tutorials. But video content does give you a lot of things that are difficult to describe in words. In addition to that, the Blender community, sponsored a lot by the Blender Foundation and Institute and Studio, does host Blender chats, blender.chat, which is a Rocket Chat instance where it's not just it's artists and developers. A lot of the development meetings and conversations are happening on Blender Chat, as well as user support, real-time support, the kind of thing where you're like, I keep clicking this and it's not working. How do I walk my way through this one part? There's a lot of people on there. Basically, it's a real-time chat environment for getting not just getting help and feedback, but also just getting to be part of the community and really being a part of that conversation. The Blender Cloud, as I mentioned before, has a lot of available assets for people to play with, but it's also a really good educational resource for getting started. And like I said, they have a really decent primer on getting going with Blender. Of course, there's also CG Cookie. They offer a bit of free content, but they also have a sort of a membership program where you get all sorts of, you basically go down the rabbit hole as deep as you want to go in terms of what Blender is capable of doing and getting educated on how to do that. BlenderArtist.org, again, is probably the largest user, at least English-speaking user community for Blender users online, and it has survived multiple iterations of social media and whatnot. And it's one of the few things where, yeah, it's still a web forum, it still exists, and people actually still go there, and it's really active. So I highly encourage you to go check that out. One of the coolest things about it, I'll say it's a little sort of best kept secret, is it's called the Weekend Challenge, where there's a prompt that's given, I think Thursday, maybe Friday, and then by Monday morning, every people who are participating have a render that they share, and then the community gets to vote as to who they like the most. There's no prizes. It's just feel good feeling, and it's a good challenge to see what somebody can produce within a weekend. And it's one of my favorite things about the site. And yeah, I'm a little biased because I'm a moderator there, but it's well worth checking out just to see what people are able to do within a week span. And then, of course, another place to get started is Blender for Dummies. I've talked about it already. I like to think it's a great book. It is the current version of it. The fourth edition of it is for Blender 2.8, but fortunately, a lot of the things that have happened between 2.8 and 3.0 user interface wise, it hasn't been that dramatic of a change. So most of what's in there should be applicable to now. And again, yeah, minor disclaimer, I'm involved with the last three, so I'm a little biased. If you happen to be a developer and interested in working with Blender, it's well worth talking about that. Pardon me. The best place to get started with that is developer.blender.org. It's currently running Fabricator for that, and they're in conversations of what they might migrate that over to, since the folks who are developing Fabricators have basically stopped working on that. So they're working on trying to figure out what to switch over to, and we'll see what that happens in the next handful of months, I'm sure. But all of the bug reporting and really tracking the active development of Blender, that all happens on developer.blender.org. Documentation, this is user land documentation, but as well as the Python API, developer documentation, how to get started, really understanding the code structure of Blender. That all happens at docs.blender.org. And particularly the developer docs and the Python API. And Python API is really probably one of the best places to get started if you're developing Blender, because just about everything that especially the user interface touches can be controlled by Blender. So anything a user can do, a Python script can do. devtalk.blender.org is a user forum that's specifically focused on Blender development topics. A little bit about feature requests, a little bit about trying to figure out where things are going. They do also have a mailing list, which I'll talk about in a second, but a lot of sort of the high-level conversations and general discussions happen over there on DevTalk, and that's a discourse instance. Code.blender.org is the blog for following Blender development itself. So you have sort of the press releasey sort of thing. Here's the latest version of Blender. Here's what's happening with the Blender conference, those kinds of things. But code.blender.org is really talking about decisions that are made with respect to how Blender is coded, not just, but that talks about the libraries that are being used and chosen. It talks about development roadmap, these sort of things. If you're really interested in where Blender is going from a development standpoint, code.blender.org is a great place to check out. And again, a lot of the conversation happens on mailing lists. Blender development still actually uses those, and they're very beneficial, particularly the BF committers list. That's where anybody who does commit code to Blender's C++ base, they're often having conversations there. The way they like to think about it is conversations about a topic are likely to happen in BF committers or dev talk. Decisions tend to happen at the meetings at the Blender chat during their weekly meetings. And that is the bulk of what I was sharing for this. If there are more questions, I'm more than happy to cover them up. Not cover them, to cover them. And there's also my general contact information is there on that last slide.
All right, Jason, very good. Great job. Thank you so much. Here's what we'll do. We've got about 10 minutes left or so. In those 10 minutes, let's take a few more questions, if that's okay with you. And if you take a look over at the QA stream, let's see, SP Singh, is there any limitation of Blender being an open source product, meaning user function restrictions? Anything related to that?
Not at all. I mean, Blender is fully open source. There are, I will say, there is an ecosystem of add-ons. So again, a lot of Blender can be extended very easily with Python. And so there is a whole ecosystem of people who are like trying to do workflow tweaks or whatever, and they are selling those as add-ons either through Gumroad or on the Blender Market, which is also a CG Cookie property. And those things are typically behind a paywall, but all of the, even the add-ons, just like with WordPress, all of that stuff is still under the GPL. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, everything about Blender is open source and is intended to be so. The big thing about the Blender Foundation, and TON in particular, is trying to bring 3D to everybody.
Very good. Let's see, Carl Conrad had a question. It was a clarification on his earlier grease pencil, which you've already covered. Aaron Piotrowski, does Blender support Wacom tablets or Surface laptops with pen support?
Absolutely. One of the nice features of Blender, and not just with the grease pencil, because you can get that as well, but the pressure sensitivity when doing 3D sculpting is a really nice thing. I've been actually doing my presentation on my Cintiq here because I actually use that for when I do sculpting work or do grease pencil work. You get pressure sensitivity for, and you can control the influence of whatever brush you happen to be choosing, and it's really handy for those particular tasks.
Very nice. Let's see. I'm actually just going through these. Andrea Kwan had the Sophie Jantak suggestion asking if that was the person you were referring to. I think someone in chat confirmed that he did think it was Sophie. So he feels like
Yeah, I
that is
believe you're right.
correct. Yep. Let's
Yep.
see, Sylvain Leroux. Speaking of 2D animation, could I use Blender as a replacement for Adobe After Effects?
Oh, that's a deep well to jump into. So here's the thing. Workflow wise, I will say in terms of actual content, I would say yes. That said, it's a different workflow. Blender has a built-in compositor. So a lot of the compositing and image compositing things that you can do in After Effects, you can also do in Blender. The difference is that it's a node-based compositor, which means so getting into the weeds or specifics here, After Effects is more layer-based, right? And so one layer is going to feed into the next, is going to feed into the next, whereas Blender is more node-based and the pieces tend to be a bit more modular. And that's more akin to a compositor like Nuke or Shake from way back in the day, or I think Fusion's another common one right now. The other thing is that because it is built on top of a 3D tool, it may not have all of the speed optimizations that you would get in After Effects. So if you're trying to do a really complex comp, that might render slower from Blender, from its node editor, than you would otherwise get from something like After Effects or even Nuke. If you're really interested in getting that kind of visual effects stuff going on, another thing to look into was Natron. The development on that one stalled a little bit, but that one's another one to look at. That said, I forgot to mention Blender does have motion tracking. So if you wanted to use it for visual effects like you would in After Effects, to do motion tracking to blur something as it's moving through the screen, or do digital augmentation and those sort of things, Blender can do it. And just in that case, it would be, I would say that the rendering speed for the compositor is not necessarily as optimized as a dedicated compositor.
We'll take one more in the Q&A stream, then we'll move over to chat. I know we've got a couple of questions that were submitted via the chat stream. This final one from the Q&A feature, does Blender somehow support creative virtual VR worlds?
So one of the things that was worked on in Blender was integration with OpenHMD, which is an open head-mounted display. And so one of the open projects was actually focused on generating VR and AR content for that kind of thing. And I will say that they have tools now in Blender for working with Blender with AR tools. So they've been working on getting a head-mounted display so that you can actually work in Blender's 3D environment as if it's your virtual environment. As far as generating content for VR and AR, the workflow for that is actually not too dissimilar from any other content. You're modeling your animation, and really it's the assembly process of getting your scene and your layout and driving that production component of that. Blender 2.8, when that was released, Blender used to have, before that, Blender had an integrated game engine. Blender no longer has that. They pulled that out because a lot of the code was, what we'll say, atrophying. And so that's been pulled out. So if you really want to get Blender content into VR or AR, really at that point, you're talking about generating your content in Blender and then doing your layout, doing the rest of the AR and VR assembly in another application, be it, say, Unity, Unreal Engine. I think Godot could also do it. I'm not as, I haven't been keeping up with Godot as much as possible, but that's really right now for VR and AR. Blender is mostly for content creation, not so much for the whole VR scene.
All right. Okay, I'm going to move over to chat really quickly. And Jason, are you okay with going over by just a few minutes?
Sure.
You
Like
sure?
I said, I have a tendency to go on and on about the topic, so I don't have a
No,
problem.
you're fine. Look,
I don't want
it's
to waste anybody else's time.
well, look, we always make a commitment to attendees that we'll try to wrap up on time. but we are getting so many questions. I thought this might happen. So I do want to maybe try to get maybe a few of those from the chat stream answered before we wrap up for the day. And again, speaking of shameless plugs, right? You are going to be delivering a longer presentation, Open Source 101, on March the 29th. So if anyone attending today wants to watch maybe a more hands-on presentation, you can certainly do that at OS 101. And registration for that event opens up next Tuesday, and you'll be notified via email when registration. It's free, so you can attend that event for free, and then within the event, attend Jason's extended session on this same topic. So with all that said, Raymond, he asks, how can he enter giveaways? Jennifer just posted the link to the WUFU forum. If you're interested in a giveaway today, that link was just posted. Aaron said they were late joining. Is this going to be posted somewhere, and can I rewatch it? We are recording today, and we're going to try to edit this quickly and get it up on our YouTube channel and then available publicly by the end of this week. So we'll notify everybody via email, via social media, to let you know when this is up, so that you can go back and either watch again or maybe catch the second half, something like that, that maybe you weren't able to catch the first time around. Let's see, Justin Ratcliffe, who is with Fidelity, he did have a question. Let's see, does the Blender Foundation collaborate with the Academy Software Foundation on some of those protocols?
Yeah, and actually, I'm going to stop my screen share so I can gesticulate in video. So yeah, the Academy Foundation, Academy Software Foundation, was for anyone who's not familiar with it, is a organization that was started from the film and animation and visual effects industry, specifically focused on there's a number of open source tools and libraries that have come out of there because they had the realization that collaboration is better. They're not competing. Their intellectual property and their competition isn't on the tools that are using necessarily. There are a few rare exceptions, Pixar's animation tools and those sort of things, but by and large, the underpinnings that they're using are easily shareable. It's not going to take away from anything. So you have things like OpenEXR, you have things like OpenImage.io, and a whole bevy of things. And so they had these releases, but there was no organization that was sort of organizing the release of that. And the ASWF is that organization. And the Blender Foundation, I believe, is a member of that. I think recently there's been a little bit of a kerfuffle. Kerfuffle's the word. I'm going to use that one. Where one of the things that I think is sponsored by the Academy of Software Foundation is the VFX reference platform, which is a general. It's what it sounds like. It's a reference document that says these are the versions of different libraries versus of Python versus of glibc operating system versions that they're intending to use, and they update that every year based on what they're comfortable doing. And the difficulty with that is that the VFX reference platform tends to lag a bit in terms of the latest the latest libraries and things coming out. In the last 2 years, the VFX industry just finished migrating. Some of them still haven't finished, from Python 2 to Python 3. That's the type of latency we're talking about in terms of getting their systems up to date with something current. And so Blender, again, is addressing a bunch of different markets, not markets, but different user bases, I should say, where you have television commercials, you have video games, you have research and science and computer science and all of these things. And so trying to meet all of those needs, even operating system distribution, because the VFX platform is often referencing a version of Python, for instance, and that's the real catch, a version of Python that is not is 6 months from being end of life, or those sorts of things, and that tends to complicate matters a bit. And so recently, the Blender Foundation decided that they're not going to adhere to the VFX reference platform, and there's a lot of conversation and discussion about that, and it's still sort of going on. But this is a long way of saying yes, they do collaborate with them. There has been this most recent thing where it's been difficult, but that's where things kind of sit with that.
Jason, this will be the last one. Is there an optimal hardware configuration for Blender?
Big and fast is the sort of the dirty answer to that. The The biggest thing for Blender really at this point is having solid video acceleration, and in particular, a decent GPU. It works on a lot of them that you wouldn't expect it to, and it actually, I've had it work with software OpenGL, but your performance starts to suffer pretty poorly, pretty quickly, and so um, you know, open source drivers notwithstanding, NVIDIA video cards tend to still give you the best performance. AMD cards are giving you a little bit better than they had been. AMD has actually been contributing a lot of fundamental code specifically to Cycles, Blender's render engine, to get it to play nice and function better on their hardware. But yeah, the biggest thing right now is that Blender, from painting pixels on the screen standpoint, it's an OpenGL program, and they haven't migrated the code base to Vulkan or anything yet, so it's all OpenGL, and so there's benefits and trade-offs to that, and some of that tends to be the hardware that's optimized for it.
Okay, I lied. There was one more, and I promise this is definitely the last one. Let's see. Will Hobbs said, Carolina, the University of South Carolina uses Godot to teach young students game design as an entry point to programming. Can you elaborate briefly on how Blender's Python API can be used to teach K through 12 students?
Oh, there's so many cool things about that. So it's one of my favorite things in so when you learn programming in general, a lot of the times you're starting with stuff that's happening on the command line, right? You say, print a screen or echo or whatever language you're doing, and it will say, oh, I get the words on screen, or you're asking for prompts and those sort of things. And you get some sort of gratification from that, but it's really just images, it's just words on a screen. You don't really get as much of a sense of what's going on, because trying to do graphical user interface programming on top of learning the concepts of software development, it's not easy, it's hard. But because of Blender's Python API, you can say, you can actually do something physically in Blender, move a cube however many units in one direction. And when you do that action, there's a log in Blender that says this is the Python that would have done that exact same action. And so you get to see the function that does the thing when you do the thing. And then you can actually paste that in Blender's built-in Python console and see the results of that happening in real time. And so the level of gratification you get, and then you can say, okay, what if I did that as a loop? Oh, it's just going to keep going in that direction. Oh, okay, so that's how loops work. How do I get it to zigzag back and forth? Okay, well, that's a different type of loop. What if I wanted to work with, the whole, then you start branching into things where you start talking about variables, and there's so much that can be done, and I think has been done in terms of teaching how to do basic programming concepts, but getting that visual feedback, that visual confirmation of this does that, and I would say a slightly more gratifying way, especially for the K through 12 set.
Very good. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and bring my video up. And what we'll do is, let's see, I'm at about 107, 108. So we went about 7 or 8 minutes over. I apologize to everybody, but I do want to thank Jason. You were game to do that, Jason. And we were getting so many questions. Actually, we received a number of questions we just weren't able to get to. So maybe at Open Source 101, if anyone can attend, maybe there'll be a chance for some attendee participation and attendee engagement there. Also, Jason, I'm going to put you on the spot just a little bit. Apologies ahead of time. If someone wants to maybe follow up with a question directly, what's the best way to contact you, or should they reach out to you? I know you're traveling, so it might be, challenging to respond and things like that, but is Twitter the best way, or, through your personal website?
Yeah, I respond to everything. I just maybe not do it on the same day. So that's why I put the contact information on on that last slide. I'm whatever social media you happen to be on, chances are good I'm there as Monster Java Guns. It's easier to spell than my name. It's an anagram. Otherwise, yeah, Jason at monsterjavaguns.com, or you can get that through my website, which is again monsterjavaguns.com. That's the easiest way. Any of those routes, I tend to monitor them regularly, but not fastidiously. So, so that's the answer there.